Okay, great. So good. So just to once again to say that in just a couple of days we're going to be celebrating Pesach. We're going to be gathering together for the Haggadah or the Seder, and it's an evening that takes a huge amount of preparation, and whether from the cleaning or from the cooking, not to mention the preparation for the Haggadah itself, in terms of perhaps preparing and reviewing it. I mentioned on Shabbat that there is a minhag to read through the Haggadah on the Shabbat Haggadol, so that kind of to use those afternoons in order to prepare for the upcoming festival. And so there's lots of things to prepare for the Haggadah. But what I find is, to a large extent, is that as we near or as we actually begin the Haggadah, we often find that we're just kind of going through it, and without actually taking a step back and reflecting on it, it actually seems like for lack of a better term, a cholent, right? Like a mix of lots of different things going on. What exactly is it about? There's obviously some of the famous passages that we know, but actually, if you look through it, it almost feels confused. It's confusing. You're kind of having a whole variety of texts, and the question of kind of how do they fit together, right? How do they join up to actually represent a whole unit is a bit tricky, is actually a bit difficult. And in order to answer it, it really requires pulling it apart, looking a little bit at its historic development to kind of, shall we say, put together what the, shall we say, original components of the Haggadah were, and what are the things that perhaps have been added to it over the centuries. So not only does this exercise help in terms of simply understanding the essence of the Haggadah, and that's my goal tonight, is to get into that, and it's part of a new series which I'm calling The Essence Of, where each month we'll look at some other piece of Jewish liturgy to kind of get to the nub of what it's actually about, whether it's Kiddush or Zemirot or Musaf or the Haggadah. And so that's my goal, is to really pick it apart in order to get to the essence of what it's actually about. And by getting to the essence, it will, I think, for many, I know certainly for myself it's been the case, will enable us to hopefully have a, shall we say, a more meaningful, Seder experience, because it will be something that will, hey Ben, because it will be, something that we will understand what exactly is the point of it. So I don't know, people have lots of different customs when it comes to the Haggadah, and because it's a home-based mitzvah, it means that really the traditions that we may have within our families essentially are invisible, to everybody else. And so as a result, there's a whole variety of customs out there. There's obviously some famous ones that kind of reflect, general geographic origins of communities and so forth. But really, when you get down to it, it's something becomes highly personalized. And so it could be some things that I referred to, I'll say, there is this practice of doing it. It may be your practice, it may not, but hopefully it'll still be illustrative for the purpose that we're trying to get at. I'll say, because I'll probably be referring to Dorothy from time to time during the class, because Dorothy's family has its origins in the S&P. So Dorothy, I may ask you some questions because I'll be curious, but would you mind, just for everyone's benefit, saying what your family background is and who your family were? Excuse me, I apologize. I meant to say Eve. Please excuse me. I'm looking at Eve saying Dorothy. I see Dorothy's name written in front of me, but I'm referring to Eve. So Eve, can you, sorry about that. Would you mind just kind of
well, I don't think that we had special apart from the tunes, I don't think we had special customs. Did we have anything different for when you came to the family?
Yes, it was different, but
We
Because
didn't
I'm
have any.
Ashkenazi, coming from an Ashkenazi background completely.
My mother was Ashkenazi, so for example, we didn't have rice or any of the kitniot. But the
But
actual reading of the Haggadah.
who is your father? Can you just tell everyone
My father was Alan Nunes Navarro, and he was and his father was Joseph Navarro, Nunes Navarro, and his father was Jacob Nunes Navarro, who I think you'll find his name somewhere in Beavis Marks. So there are several generations. They came to London in the 1850s, but I'm also aware of special traditions, not from Amsterdam.
From Amsterdam. So I guess even the melodies is interesting because
yes, the melodies are probably like for example
that we use. Oh, we use the Haggadah.
Yes, we use the Haggadah from the Sephardi prayer book, and so some of the wording is different from the Ashkenazi, and the melodies. I think that like the Hallel, according to the Spanish and Portuguese tradition.
I think it's interesting, and I don't know if it's a project your family has ever done. Obviously, the Hallel is well known, but if any of the other bits, particularly around the beginning of the Seder and Magid, to record those melodies would be really interesting, because even the issue of what is the S&P melody for X or Y, again, because it's family based, it may have been in your family, but not necessarily in somebody else's family.
Just something like Halachma.
Exactly. Yeah. So I know some melodies through New York that came from Chacham Gaon. So, but again, he wasn't from London, so it's I know kind of S&P type melodies, but not necessarily London per se or Amsterdam. So perhaps when you have some time to record some of the melodies, I'm sure everyone would be interested to.
Okay, we'll see if we
if it comes across. It's even if not before Pesach, during the year. But what I'm going to say, so that was all a bit of a larger introduction, that basically at the beginning of the Haggadah, some people have the custom to simply read through what's known as the Kadesh Orchatz, right? Which is to sing through the names of the different stages of the Haggadah. The Kadesh Orchatz, Karpas, Yachatz. Again, presumably an Ashkenazi melody, but kind of going through. And what that highlights is that the Haggadah actually consists of lots of different parts, right? Because there isn't a single thing that one is doing at the Haggadah. There's actually several different things that a person is doing, which is why it's known as the Seder. The same word as Sidur, right? Which means order, right? And basically, there are a variety of mitzvot that we fulfill on the night of Pesach, certainly in biblical times. And in theory, each of those mitzvot are separate from one another. They're different mitzvot, right? The mitzvah, because it's festival, to say kiddush, right? The mitzvah to tell the story, the mitzvah to eat matzah, the mitzvah to eat maror, right? These are, shall we say, separate mitzvot. But they're all meant to be done in the evening of Pesach, so they've been, shall we say, brought together into one service, right? Into one ceremony that contains those mitzvot. But fundamentally, they are different. They are different mitzvot. So let me give her an example. So there's well known, right, that during the Haggadah, we drink 4 cups of wine. And there is discussions in the Talmud around, what is the significance of 4 cups, right? And the answer which the Talmud gives is it has to do with the 4 languages of redemption that appear in the Torah, right? That it says, right? I took you out and I saved you and I redeemed you and I took you. And so as a result, we have these 4 cups of wine. It's a very nice explanation, but it's probably, shall we say, after the fact, because essentially there's a reason that we have 4 cups, because the first cup is Kiddush. The second cup is while we say shall we say the tell the story, we raise a glass and toast. We then have the cup that we say for the Birkat HaMazon, for the grace after meals. Many of us don't have that custom regularly, but there is such a practice. And so on a special occasion like this, we all do it, of saying Birkat HaMazon over a glass of wine. And then when we say the Hallel, we have another cup of wine. And so essentially, those 4 cups of wine are there because we have reason to simply have 4 cups of wine. Once we have 4 cups, it was a bit of a reflection of what is the significance? We never have 4 cups of wine. So why are we having 4 cups of wine, on this occasion? And we kind of, shall we say, amend to that practice an explanation for it. That's really just a way of saying we're doing lots of things on the night of the Haggadah. We've put them together into, our Haggadah, but really they're different from one another, and that just adds to the complexion or the complexity or the confusion over what is the essence of the Seder night. And what I'd particularly like to focus on is, shall we say, the meat of the Haggadah, which is not the meat, but the Magid, right? The telling of the story, because of course that is a mitzvah, right? The mitzvah of Sipur Yitziat Mitzrayim, of retelling the Exodus from Egypt. Now, in Magid, right? I imagine it's familiar to most of you. There's a lot of text in there. There's quite a lot that goes on in that, and it actually gets a bit confusing. Of what are we doing here? What is the retelling? Is it simply to say as much as possible, or is there something else that's going on, right? Part of the Magid is the Manishtana. Why is this night different from other nights? Is that central to Magid? Is that superfluous? What exactly is happening with all of these different texts that we have over here? So what I'd like to do is just to share with you the text from the Mishnah that kind of gets at one of the core principles in it. So what we have over here, I'll just read it to you in the English. I have it highlighted in the blue if it's coming up on your screen that way, where it says the following. It says, when teaching his son about the Exodus, he begins with the Jewish people's disgrace and concludes with their glory, right? So the Mishnah puts forward this principle that the telling of the story is not simply, we went out from Egypt, but actually this idea of saying we need to talk about the challenges and then shall we say, the glory that came with it, right? And it then continues and it says, and he expounds from the passage, an Aramean tried to destroy my father. And the declaration one recites when presenting his first fruits of the temple until he concludes explaining the entire section. So that's very brief. Let me just kind of back up on it and explain exactly what it is saying. So what it's saying is there's essentially 2 core parts to Magid. One is this beginning with Gnut, right? Starting with the difficulty and concluding with the Shabbat, with the praise, and then expounding on a series of verses that begin with the words Arami Oved Avi, right? That an Aramean tried to destroy my father. Now, the Talmud engages with this question about what exactly do we mean when we say that start with something, shall we say, challenging and end with something praiseworthy. And what it presents is that actually there are 2 opinions. So there's, shall we say, the most obvious view, which is that it has to do with the Exodus itself. And it refers to the slavery, right, that we were enslaved. And then it concludes with the redemption, the fact that we were taken out from Egypt. Though there's another opinion quoted in the Gemara, which says that actually it has to do with something almost entirely different. It has to do with the fact that our ancestors were idolaters, and that, shall we say, our ancestors eventually came to monotheism, right? Came to a knowledge of God, and it's a challenging explanation, because really, what does that have to do with Pesach, right? Meaning Pesach was about the Exodus, right? Not about the fact that Abraham's father had been an idolater, and even Abraham had been an idolater. I mean, that's a much bigger story, as it were. And so, what exactly does that have to do with it? What's interesting is if one looks at the Haggadah, you find that we actually do both. We do both, right? So immediately after we say the Manishtana, we jump into that opinion that says that we start with talking about the slavery and conclude with the Exodus, right? Because the first passage after the Man Nishtana is Avadim Hayinu Lefaro b'Mitzrayim Vayotzienu Hashem Elokeinu Misham B'Yad Chazaka Yisrael Netuya, right? That we were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt, and he took us out from there, right, with an outstretched hand, and we were saved. And so you have here kind of immediately, we pose it as a question, but we immediately just say shall we say, the nub of the Haggadah. We were slaves and we were freed. And in a sense, it's okay. Close the Haggadah. You've done it. You've go on and start enjoying your matzah and soup. But we also end up including the second explanation as well. And for that, you need to skip a little bit, because basically after we start out by saying that we were slaves and we were freed, the Haggadah then kind of goes onto a tangent to basically go into this idea that we should expand upon the story, right? And it tells all the stories about rabbis that expanded on the story and they stayed up all night, and there's a mitzvah to tell the story, right? And they kind of go into the obligation, and we talk about the 4 sons, right? How do you engage all of the children in the telling of that story? But all of that is, shall we say, educational material, because the essence of the Haggadah was saying that we were slaves and we were redeemed, and essentially giving gratitude to God that took place. But if you move further in the Haggadah, basically after it says all of that, we then say the other view, which is mitchila ovdei avodah zara hayu avotenu, that originally our ancestors were idolaters. V'achshav kervanu hamakom lavodato. But now God has brought us close to his worship, and that essentially allows us to fulfill both views in the Talmud about what exactly the subject of the Haggadah actually is. And so we end up doing that, and then basically, after that is when we kind of raise the kos and we say, right, that God saved us, and if he hadn't saved our ancestors, we would still be slaves in Egypt, right? No, and we're talking about the rejoicing, right? So that basically fulfills the first half, right? The first half of the Genut and the Sheva. And then we skip to the second half, which are a series of verses. Now, these verses that we recite, which begin with the verse of Arami Ove Davi, come from Deuteronomy, and actually are the verses that one would say when they would bring the Bikurim, when someone would bring the first fruits to the temple in Jerusalem. And why these verses were selected for the retelling of the story of the Exodus, maybe because they're quite succinct. It's 5 verses that essentially talk about the descent into Egypt and the ultimate redemption from it. And quite meaningful that every time one would bring their first fruits of the land of Israel, one would recite this, shall we say, review of the national story. So it's much easier to take those verses, which people maybe knew by heart from every time they would bring their first fruits, but also it's a lot shorter than reading Exodus, which is a much longer way of telling the story. The question is what exactly do these verses even mean? Because Arami Ove David, and Aramean tried to destroy my father, right? What narrative does that actually fit into, right? Meaning we're starting to tell the story of Egypt and the Exodus. So what do we mean when we say an Aramean tried to destroy my father? Does anybody have any thought, and just how does that even connect to the story of Egypt? So I'll jump in then. So what it may have to do with is it's essentially expanding the story and saying, right, that essentially this idea of persecution didn't even begin just in Egypt, right? But already that persecution began. And the Haggadah says that who is the Aramean, right? That's Lavan, right? Who persecuted Jacob, right? And it would eventually be Joseph that would go down, but Jacob would join, right? And Jacob would eventually join with the other tribes, and that kind of begins the story of the descent to Egypt. And then we go through, right, the fact that we were persecuted in Egypt, but that ultimately we called out to God and he saved us and he redeemed us, right, and brought us out of the land. And what's interesting, and we'll get back to the connection to Bikurim, because what does that have to do with the first fruits? I mean, it doesn't seem to have anything to do with bringing your first fruits when you're a farmer in Israel, telling the story of the Exodus. Maybe we'll get back to that in a second. But essentially, and this is what's interesting, is that, shall we say, translation of Arami Oved Avi fits into the narrative that what we are essentially doing on the night of Pesach is talking about the fact that we were persecuted / enslaved and then ultimately freed. But if one actually understands that verse, it's actually saying something quite different. It's a bit of rabbinic license, the translation that an Aramean tried to destroy my forefather, right? That the Lavan tried to destroy us, because that's not actually the translation of the words Arami Oved Avi. And what it actually translates is of Arami Oved Avi, that my father was an Arami Oved, which means that my father was a wandering Aramean, right? That's the actual translation of the verse, right? If one were to, shall we say, look at it just grammatically speaking, they basically, depends how you parse those words. So is it that an Aramean Oved destroyed Avi, my father, or is it Arami Oved, a wandering Aramean, Avi was my father? And linguistically, it's actually that understanding, right? And so what does it mean that my father was a wandering Aramean? So that seems to fit into that narrative, right? That he was a wanderer, meaning that he was a pagan, essentially, right? That he was searching, as it were, right? And only then, right, did we discover God, right? And so that ends up, shall we say, that interpretation of the reading of those verses would link in well to that opinion that that's actually the theme of the night of Pesach. Now, that's not how the Haggadah translates it. Our Haggadah translates it as an Aramean tried to destroy my father, because really the primary position that the Haggadah takes, despite the fact that we include the other view, is that the Exodus, the night of Pesach, is all about the slavery and the salvation, right? And so that really becomes the primary narrative, despite the fact that there were other views. And it's interesting that we try to include those other views, despite the fact that that ultimately is not the full take of it. What's interesting, I'll just add this, there's a verse at the end of those series of verses that we don't include, which actually at the end talk about, and you brought us to the land of Israel. And that would seem to fit really well with why those verses were recited when a person brought the first fruits, because it basically talks about the full national narrative, which ends in the land of Israel, and now I'm bringing my first fruits as a Thanksgiving. And it probably, when the Haggadah was celebrated during biblical times, they probably read all of those verses, right? Because it would have fit also for the night of the Seder, right? To, shall we say, complete the story. But once we were into the diaspora, it no longer felt, shall we say, meaningful to conclude with, and we brought to Israel because, well, we weren't. We're in exile, right? So it was, shall we say, narrowed to just be about slavery and salvation. But functionally, those are the two parts of Magid, of the telling of the story, are basically saying, in short, we were slaves and we were freed, and then reading the verses that have to do with the story, right? The narrative, kind of expanding on it a bit more. And fundamentally, right, by reading those two parts, one is, shall we say, right, to use halachic terminology, right, one has fulfilled their mitzvah, right? One has done the seder night. We then, of course, end up having lots of additional texts that are amended to them, like the Manish Tanah, like the telling of the stories of the rabbis who stayed up all night recounting the story, saying what the verses are that we derive, that we have such a mitzvah to tell the story on the night of Pesach. and so on and so forth. But really, shall we say, if a person was limited in the amount of time that they have, really those would be the two parts that you would need to do. I think probably for a lot of people, they skip the verses because that feels a little, but those are actually really core, because that's Sipur Yetziat Mitzrayim. That is actually telling the story, right? Where we recite the verse, and then we say, what does each word in the verse actually refer to, right? It's quite midrashic, right? The way that it expands every word or two from every pasuk. So that's a really important part of it. What's interesting is we then have one other element which is added to the Magid, and this is the statement of Rabban Gamliel, right? Because what does Rabban Gamliel say? Rabban Gamliel then jumps in and says, anyone who doesn't say these three things has not fulfilled his mitzvah. What are the three things? Pesach, matzah, and maror. And it's a very strange teaching, because what does that mean? If you don't say those words, you haven't fulfilled your mitzvah. Like somehow it's like you say the word Pesach and you have done Pesach. It doesn't actually seem to make any sense. So there's a whole discussion around what exactly does he mean by that. And what it seems to do is it's linking the two parts of the Haggadah, right? Because essentially we have the part of the Haggadah where we tell the story, and then we have the part where we eat the Paschal offering, right? Where we eat the Pesach. In biblical times, we eat the matzah and we eat the maror. Then we eat it all together, right? A very nice, sandwich that they would have of all of those things wrapped together, almost like a shawarma. You would imagine, right? And that would be what they would eat. And what Rabban Gamliel is doing, he's joining the two things together. What exactly is he doing? What he's saying is you need to understand the meaning of those rituals, right? Because one of the things we talk about in the Haggadah is that a person is meant to demonstrate that they have gone out from Egypt, right? It's not enough to simply even just tell the story, right? There's this idea that a person should relive the story. And what Rabban Gamliel is essentially doing is he's connecting that to the things that we eat, right? So by eating the Pesach, we're remembering the Korban Pesach, right? The Paschal offering in Egypt, that they then took the blood and they were saved, right? When God passed over the Jewish homes. And we have the matzah because it reminds us of the leaving, and we have the maror that reminds us of the slavery, right? So it's the transition of the bitterness, the story where we were saved, and then ultimately the Exodus. And we put all those things together, right? Combining those different themes. But the point is that when one eats those, one is supposed to, shall we say, appreciate why we are eating those things, right? That they're actually linked to the storytelling, right? That we tell the story through these foods that we consume. And there's some scholars that suggest that perhaps he was trying to not just simply make it meaningful, but ensure that a person didn't, shall we say, associate other interpretations or meanings to the Pesach, matzah, and maror foods, because it seems that Christians were identifying other symbolism to those rituals. And so he's saying, unless you articulate what the meaning is, we have to be concerned that maybe you're actually having in mind these Christian interpretations of them. So you have to say out loud, this is what each of these things symbolize, as a way to demonstrate that you are having, shall we say, the proper kavanot. But fundamentally, whether that's correct or not, it is this idea that when we do the ritual, it's meant to be not something that we simply do, right, but something that is supposed to have deeper meaning, right, and symbolism associated with it, right? And that's what ultimately makes the night of the Haggadah so meaningful, is that it's not a dry affair, right? It's something which has questions and answers, storytelling. It has foods that we eat, right? There's all these things that we do to make it, shall we say, a sensory experience to ensure that we can, shall we say, really engage with that story, right? And it's something which I think reflects, or at least seems to indicate to us, that this is important, right? Meaning, if so much is being put into this, it must be there is a reason, right? That it's not just, if we were just, shall we say, being halachic and fulfilling the mitzvot, then we just do the things, right? But the fact that it's been crafted in such a way to really draw us into it and have, shall we say, so many ways of engaging with it, mean that the sages, by, shall we say, putting these things together into, shall we say, one elaborate ritual, not just as separate mitzvot, felt that it was necessary for us to do that because there was something we needed to take away from it. And I think ultimately that goes back to the, shall we say, to where we began, which is saying that there is a principle, right, that we are supposed to connect with, right? And it's the idea that life can be challenging, right? But that we also always maintain a sense of hope, right? A belief, right, that things can improve, right? And you find that in the food itself, right? There's the bitter and shall we say the sweet, right, that we eat together, right? And it's that idea that we have those two elements together, and actually you can't appreciate one without the other. If you only had one, it wouldn't be that. It would be nothing, right? It's only by having the contrast that something begins to, shall we say, be a bit deeper and is meant to, shall we say, penetrate for a person to really get in touch with those ideas, right? Whether those are notions of gratitude for the blessings that we have in our life, whether it's sensitivity, right, to those who are suffering, right? And if we're lucky enough not to be, right, so the ways that we can do that, right? Or whether it's just really engaging with our national story, right? There is definitely something here which is considered so important that we have to take a deep dive into it. And that ultimately makes for a very rich evening and provides lots of opportunity for us to reflect on the story. And it's probably why the rabbis kept adding and adding and adding to it, because they wanted to kind of dig deeper and deeper and deeper, even though perhaps sometimes by adding, you subtract. There's a Talmudic teaching that says, Kol ha-mosif gorea, whoever adds actually takes away. And that's something to just in general be aware of, I think, on the night of the Haggadah, that if, in a sense, we spend too much time, you can sometimes miss the point. And I think that can be a challenge, which is why I think reflecting on what is the essence of it is important, so that even if we read all of the different texts, we do it in a way where we're not, shall we say, losing our focus from what the essence of the evening actually is. So then it can be nice to kind of jump in and think about the other texts that are included in it, but not in a way where somehow we get confused about what are we actually doing here, right? To kind of keep our eye on the core teaching of the evening in a way that allows us to remain, shall we say, focused and engaged with that important message, and the meaning of it, whatever, shall we say, different meanings that we ascribe to this core principle of transition or of difference between, right, different stages or states of human experience. But it is a very rich night, and it's worth, shall we say, we put so much into it to preparing for it. It's become, shall we say, chaval, right, a pity if we don't actually connect with what we're doing, because then what's the point? So it's important to, shall we say, sometimes reflect a bit in advance in order to do that. I find for those who are, shall we say, unfortunate enough to live in the diaspora, shall we say, that's one of the benefits of doing 2 nights, is that a lot of people end up, shall we say, almost using the first night as a warm up, and then the second night can be the night to think about other ideas and to reflect on it. So for those in Israel who have one night to put all their energy into that night, you got to really be ready for it when it comes, so that you can make the most of it. But it is it's obviously, maybe nowadays it's second to Hanukkah, but it's obviously one of the most widely observed Jewish rituals. And it's for good reason. It really is, our national story, our, with core beliefs and principles and values. And to whatever extent we can kind of get through the challenges of the preparation, and perhaps at some point we can talk about what actually is necessary to do, because if you see the amount that people purchase in Kosher Kingdom, they're purchasing a lot more than they need to. But that's for a different that's for a different shiur. But really, to, shall we say, not lose sight of what the night is about, which is a very special night. So that's, shall we say, a brief introduction to the essence of the Haggadah. If anyone has any questions or thoughts, please go ahead.
We have a shiur before Shabbat Hagadol. The shiur has been going on for 34 years, and each Shabbat Hagadol, the Rav gives another, sort of works his way through the Haggadah. And this week he'd got to Echad Mi Yodea. And it's very interesting what you were saying about the difference between, shall we say, Ashkenazim and Sephardim. He shows, first of all, the one that we know, and then the translation from Yiddish, where 11 is either, the 7, midot, or bar mitzvah, 13,
right.
Midot, or bar mitzvah. In Ladino, the 11 is Once Hermanos Sin Yosef. His 11 brothers without Joseph.
That's right, yeah.
And 7 is 7 days with Shabbat.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so they've got different translations, different indications of what they are. Just interesting, just fun.
Yeah, very interesting. Yeah. In the Haggadah that I have, which is from Rabbi Angel, his family is Ladino background, so he includes some of the songs in Ladino. And very, very, very interesting. We have some people in the community who know Ladino, so we often sing it, and it's a lot of fun. So good. I hope. Does anybody have any other thoughts or questions? Sorry for cutting off. Yes, Eddie.
Yeah, I've got a question. It's not directly actually connected with the Seder night or the Haggadah, but I'm puzzled by the fact that Adar is always regarded as a happy month. When Adar begins, everybody gets in a happy mood, obviously because of Purim and probably the main reason. But what I find is strange is that despite the fact that Adar is a happy month, Nisan obviously is also even a happier month, we still say Tachanun throughout Adar. We don't say Tachanun at all during Nisan, despite the fact that the Omer, which is regarded generally as a sad time of the year, the second half of Nisan is during the Omer. So why, presumably, the rabbis decided that we should recite Tachanun during Adar, but not at all during Nisan?
Yeah, it's interesting. It seems to be somewhat associated with the fact that there are so many days in Nisan where we already don't say Tachanun, that they basically just said, just don't say it the whole month. That they kind of, because there were so many days already that you don't say it, that there was this real identification of, this is just a month, without that. Obviously, like you said, we consider the month of Adar happy, but fundamentally, there's really just a couple days that we wouldn't say Tachanun, over Purim. So it seems that it has to do a bit with that notion. And obviously, with something similar to Tishrei as well. So I don't know if that is really a sufficient to answer, but I think that's the general approach to understanding it. Thank you, Eddie. Good to see you, Eddie, as well. Good. Anybody have any other final thoughts? Brilliant. Okay, so then I'm going to wish everybody a Moadim L'Simcha. Absolutely wonderful to see everyone. I hope you have a wonderful Pesach with lots of joy and nice time with friends and family. For those of you that are at Bevis, looking forward to celebrating together with you. And for those of you not at Bevis, please God, next year in Jerusalem, we'll all celebrate together. Okay, everyone.
Thank you very much. And Chag Sameach.
Thank you. Chag Sameach. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks very much.
Bye.